Leonard Strauss was a name often mentioned by the German press, with phrases like tech genius, the startup king of Berlin, or the cold man of the digital age. Known for his sharp speeches, proud gaze, and untouchable demeanor, Leonard rarely showed emotion. People even joked that he could lose millions of euros on the stock market and his face would remain expressionless. But that afternoon, Leonard was a completely different image on the gridlocked highway north of Munich. Among the endless line of cars, he sat in his black Audi, tie loosened halfway, hair disheveled, eyes sunken from many sleepless nights. In the back seat, his 7-year-old son Jonas was crying uncontrollably, not the whining for candy or a childish tantrum. It was the cry of a sensory overload, a world too bright, loud, and fast pressing down on a young mind with no words for defense. Jonas kicked the seat, fists clenched tight, his face flushed red. The sobs turned into muffled screams. Every sound pierced Leonard's ears, making him feel more powerless than ever. He had once signed billion-euro contracts, led hundreds of engineers through massive tech projects, but now he couldn't do anything to soothe his only child. "Jonas, mind shots, please. We're almost there." His voice was hoarse, trying to stay calm. One hand gripped the steering wheel tightly, the other stretched behind the seat, trying to reach his son's shoulder. But Jonas didn't hear, or couldn't hear. The boy thrashed like he was fighting gravity itself, his head banging against the window, tears soaking his face. Leonard felt his hand trembling, veins bulging at the knuckles, not from anger but despair. All the strength he had used to battle boardrooms and rivals now proved useless before a child's cry. A child he loved more than life. In that moment, for the first time since his wife died, Leonard felt his eyes sting. Car horns blared, engines roared, and the glaring sunset trapped in the traffic jam only worsened Jonas's distress. Leonard knew he couldn't sit there one more minute. He switched on the indicator, turned into the emergency exit lane, and veered onto a small road leading to a suburban town he'd never noticed. And then, like a lifebuoy tossed into the sea of despair, he saw an old wooden sign with faded red letters. Helga's Stube. A roadside diner plain, even worn down. No ratings, no shimmering lights, no glossy menus. Just a small house with a kitchen smoke curling out, rich with the smell of soup and strong coffee. Leonard pulled into the parking lot. He turned off the engine, took a deep breath, and looked into the rearview mirror. Jonas was still sobbing, cheeks flushed, breathing ragged. Leonard closed his eyes and murmured in German, like a quiet prayer. "Ich versuche es, mein Sohn. Ich schwöre, ich versuche es." "I'm trying, my son. I swear I'm trying." He unbuckled the seatbelt and reached back to lift Jonas into his arms. 7 years old, over 25 kilos, that small body flailed as if trying to break free. But Leonard held on, arms like a worn-out firefighter still clutching the last victim from the flames. The bell jingled as he pushed open the diner door. Every curious, surprised, even annoyed gaze turned sharply toward the two of them. In that moment, Leonard Strauss, the powerful billionaire, felt more exposed, weak, and alone than ever. The wooden door closed behind them, the small bell still chiming faintly in the air. Helga's Stube wasn't a big diner, just a dozen wooden tables lined up closely, dim white neon lights casting a pale hue over the worn tile floor. The smell of potato soup mixed with thick black coffee and lingering cigarette smoke from a few patrons' coats. The once bustling room suddenly froze as Leonard entered, carrying Jonas. Every eye turned to them. An older man in a Bayern Munich cap paused, looking up from his coffee cup. A middle-aged couple eating schnitzel stopped chewing, their gaze glittering more with judgment than sympathy. A fork clinked lightly against a plate, a tiny sound, but to Leonard it was like a hammer pounding inside his skull. He took a deep breath and hurried to the farthest corner of the diner, choosing a table beneath a foggy window pane. He set Jonas down on a worn leather seat, quickly shrugged off his coat and draped it high to block out the harsh light, trying to minimize further sensory triggers. Jonas was still hiccuping, body trembling in short bursts, his hand tapping rhythmically against his knee in an anxious loop. Leonard slumped into the seat across from him, his elbows braced on the table, one hand running down his weary face. The tears had receded somewhere deep in his chest, leaving behind a suffocating tightness. He looked at his son, lips quivering, and whispered in a voice barely audible even to himself, Ich weiß nicht mehr, was du brauchst, Jonas. Ich weiß nicht, wie ich dir helfen soll. I no longer know what you need, Jonas. I don't know how to help you anymore. No response. Jonas kept rocking and tapping, his gaze locked on an invisible void. Nothing from the boy reached Leonard. And outside, the world kept turning, strangers still watching, still silently thinking, a spoiled child or a helpless father. In Leonard's mind, the boardroom reappeared, those cold faces tracking his every move in the company, waiting for him to stumble so they could take his place. To them, Leonard Strauss was not allowed to be weak. To them, his widower status, his son's special needs, meant nothing but excuses. He had to be perfect, always composed. But here, in the corner of a humble diner, he had no strength to pretend. He leaned down and rummaged through Jonas's backpack. A container of apfelmus, a small plastic spoon, a packet of tissues, all the familiar things he always carried like a lifeline. Leonard peeled back the foil lid, the sweet sour scent of apples wafting up. He forced a weary smile. Jonas, here it is, your favorite. Just a bite, okay? He extended the spoon toward his son. Jonas didn't respond. Seconds passed, then a few more. The boy's eyes remained blank, his body still swaying. Leonard's hand began to tremble, the spoon quivering in midair. Then it slipped and fell onto the wooden table with a soft clang, a sound that seemed to rip through the last thread of his fragile endurance. Leonard bowed his head, and a broken whisper escaped his lips, jagged, painful as a blade. Ich kann nicht mehr. I can't do this anymore. In that moment, he felt like he had truly hit rock bottom. Not in business, not before the press, but as a father. The man who had once built a tech empire now sat completely powerless before the cries of his child. And just when Leonard thought there was no way out, another sound came from behind him, slow footsteps, calm, steady, gentle yet firm. A woman's voice rose soft and low, unhurried, without judgment. Darf ich helfen? May I help? Leonard looked up, slowly, as if summoning the last of his strength. Standing before him wasn't a nosy diner or someone ready to offer hollow advice. It was the restaurant's waitress, around 25, petite, yet with steady, unwavering eyes. Her deep brown skin stood out under the pale neon light, her curly hair neatly tied back with a red bandana. The name tag on her chest read, Amira D. A damp cloth was in her hand, and a faint but genuine smile was on her lips. No trace of pity, no awkwardness, and none of the judgment Leonard had grown so used to. Her voice, warm and low with a hint of West African cadence, rang out again. Mind if I clean this up for you? Leonard hesitated for a second, then nodded. His voice came out hoarse. Yeah, sorry for the mess. Amira leaned down and wiped away the spilled applesauce on the table. Her movements were calm and unhurried, as if a child crying in a diner was nothing unusual. When she finished, she didn't stand right back up. Instead, she gently lowered herself to Jonas's eye level. Hallo, kleiner Mann. Hello, little man. Jonas didn't look at her. He kept rocking, his hand still tapping rhythmically on his knee. But Amira didn't step back, didn't flinch. She observed the boy as if listening to another language, the language of tapping, breathing, of tense, repetitive movement. Leonard sighed and shook his head. It's no use. He doesn't respond. Amira glanced at him, her deep black eyes gleaming with quiet understanding. She asked softly, What's his name? Jonas. He's 7. A soft smile flickered on Amira's lips. She turned back to Jonas, her voice now like a lullaby. Jonas, you like apfelmus, don't you? Jonas didn't answer. But Leonard noticed just the way she said his son's name, slow, gentle, respectful, changed the air around them ever so slightly. Amira looked at Leonard and lowered her voice. May I try feeding him? Leonard froze for a moment. His first instinct was to decline. He'd grown used to failure, to the pitying eyes of people who thought they understood, but never truly did. But Amira's gaze was different. No pity, no curiosity, just patience. He gave a slight nod. Okay, go ahead. Amira sat on the bench beside Jonas, not directly across but slightly angled, leaving a respectful space. She picked up the spoon, scooped a bit of applesauce, and waited. No urging, no rush. Just waited. And then, amid the diner's tense silence, something small yet miraculous happened. Jonas's eyes slowly lifted. First, they looked at the spoon. Then, briefly, they flicked toward Amira's face. Just a blink, a split second, but Leonard saw it clearly, a flicker of connection. Jonas opened his mouth. Amira gently guided the spoon in. The boy swallowed. No resistance, no crying, just a straightforward motion that, to Leonard, felt like a miracle. He sat frozen, hand gripping the table's edge. His voice cracked into a whisper. Jonas. Amira smiled, as if this were perfectly ordinary. She whispered to Jonas, offering a second spoonful. Gut gemacht, kleiner Mann. Good job, little man. And the boy opened his mouth again. At that moment, Leonard Strauss, the tech billionaire, and the once untouchable man felt something crack open inside him. Not despair again, but hope. A kind of hope he thought had been buried with his wife's grave. The diner gradually returned to its usual rhythm. The soft clinking of cutlery resumed, and a few diners returned to their dinners, but Leonard remained frozen. Before his eyes, Jonas, his son, whom he hadn't been able to coax into eating in public for over a year, was quietly accepting spoonfuls of apfelmus from a stranger. The scene was so fragile and sacred that Leonard hardly dared to breathe, afraid even the slightest movement might shatter the miracle. Amira gently offered the last spoonful, then stopped. She set the spoon down and used a napkin to softly wipe the corner of Jonas's mouth. Her voice was small, yet firm. Gut, Jonas. Sehr gut. Good job, Jonas. Very good. Jonas didn't say a word, but he had stopped crying. His tapping slowed, becoming more rhythmic. A rare stillness settled over him, like a lake after a storm. Leonard felt his throat tighten. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He asked softly, "How did you know what to do?" Amira remained seated, her fingers interlaced, eyes still on Jonas rather than Leonard. "My little brother, Musa. He's 11. Nonverbal. I grew up learning every tiny signal from him, like learning the alphabet. The hand rhythm, the eyes, the breathing. Jonas. He's like Musa." The name Musa landed like a bridge between two distant shores. Leonard stared at her for a long moment, imagining a young girl caring for her brother every day, without experts, without aids, only love and instinct. He let out a slow breath, long and heavy, as if releasing something he'd carried for too long. "You've done in minutes. More than I've managed all year." Amira turned to him, her gaze not proud, but laced with empathy and a quiet fatigue. "You've tried. I can see that." Leonard lowered his head. His hand, still holding the spoon, was trembling. "I'm not sure anymore. I'm a good entrepreneur, but as a father, I've failed." Amira shook her head, her voice firm. "Number A. Failed father walks away. You didn't. Even exhausted, you carried him in here. You still tried to comfort him even when you had nothing left. That's not failure, that's staying." Leonard looked up for the first time in months. He met the eyes of a stranger and didn't feel judged. He saw an accurate understanding in her gaze, not theoretical, not pitying. He swallowed hard, then asked a question even he didn't expect. "Have you ever thought about working with autistic children? Outside of this place?" Amira gave a faint, almost bitter smile. "I take online social work courses slowly, because I can't afford much. I've thought about working in special needs care, but no one's ever given me a chance. I'm just the girl who wipes tables and serves beer and soup. They don't see me as anything else." Leonard's hand clenched slightly on the edge of the table. His eyes lit up, just for a moment. A thought bold, maybe even reckless, flickered in his mind, but it was strong enough to make his heart beat faster. He murmured, almost a whisper, "Maybe. I will give you that chance." Amira looked surprised, her brows narrowing slightly in confusion. Leonard didn't explain. He leaned back in his seat, his gaze resting on his son, who now sat quietly, head leaning against the window. And for the first time in years, Leonard felt something stir inside him. Not exhaustion, but the faint, unfamiliar flutter of something else. Hope. The scent of potato soup and thick coffee lingered in Helga's Stube. Jonas leaned against the window pane, his breathing even, his hands still tapping but slower, no longer like a storm. Leonard sat across from him, eyes fixed on his son, though his thoughts drifted to the young woman who had salvaged an afternoon that had seemed unbearable. He spoke slowly, voice still shaky. I have a foundation in Berlin. It's meant to support children with developmental disorders. But in truth, it's hollow. Just reports, conferences, and contracts. It's missing something vital. Amira furrowed her brows, gently setting her napkin on the table. Missing what? Leonard looked up, meeting her gaze, no longer the steely businessman, but a father desperate for answers. People like you. People who live with this every single day. Amira let out a quiet laugh, not amusement, but more like a sigh that had learned to laugh to protect itself. You just saw me wipe a table and feed a few spoonfuls of applesauce. That's not exactly a resume. Leonard shook his head more firmly now. Number. That is the experience. More than any polished CV. You did what none of my expert team could do. You got Jonas to open his mouth. Amira's eyes darkened for a moment, then lit up. She leaned forward, elbows on the table, looking Leonard straight in the eye. So, what you want me to be the poster girl for your foundation? The poor, brown-skinned waitress lifted as an inspiring token? A face to show how human your work is? Leonard froze for a second. Her words were sharp, like a blade, but they woke him up. He nodded slowly, then answered. Number, I don't need a symbol. I need someone at the table. Someone to help make decisions, to build real programs. Not to make reports look good, to give the foundation a soul. Silence settled between them. Jonas let out a soft murmur and drifted back into his quiet rocking. Amira crossed her arms, her gaze still skeptical but softer now. If you want me, then I have a condition. What condition? Leonard leaned in. I won't be anyone's Aushängeschild. I won't be your beautiful signboard hanging at the door. I want a Platzim Tisch, a real seat at the table, real say. I want to help build something that changes life for families like mine and Musa's. If that's not what this is, then I'm out. Leonard looked at her for a long moment. He saw his years of struggling to raise his son in her eyes, and he saw her as a young woman carrying a family on her back. He inhaled deeply, then gave a soft, weary, genuine smile. A seat at the table. I promise. Amira leaned back slightly, the corner of her mouth curling into a half-skeptical grin. You're a strange man. First time we meet, and you're already trying to drag me to Berlin. Leonard laughed, a sound he hadn't made freely since his wife died. Not drag, invite. You can say no, and I'd still owe you lunch and a slice of Apfelstrudel. For the first time, Amira truly smiled, not defensively, a real smile. She looked at Jonas, then back at Leonard. One weekend, I'll observe. No promises. That's enough, Leonard said, nodding firmly, sealing what might be the most important deal of his life. He didn't know then that in that very moment when a roadside waitress agreed to step into his world, the empire he once built with steel and silicon was about to be reborn through spoonfuls of applesauce, the rhythm of patience, and the heartbeat of understanding. A gloomy Monday morning in Berlin. The glass tower that housed Leonard Strauss's charitable foundation glowed with fluorescent light, its hallways buzzing with hurried footsteps. The board of directors sat in a neat circle on the 10th floor. Laptops open, papers piled high, their voices exchanged in precise clinical jargon. Protocols, metrics, impact reports. The door opened. Leonard walked in with Amira by his side. She wore an old wool coat, her curls tucked under a red bandana, her gaze steady but cautious. A few faces tightened instantly. One silver-haired board member muttered loud enough for the entire room to hear. Who's this? A visitor? Leonard took his seat at the head of the table and answered calmly. This is Amira Diallo. She'll be joining today's meeting. Murmurs rippled around the room. A woman with gold-rimmed glasses raised an eyebrow. She's not staff, has no credentials, no academic background. Mr. Strauss, this foundation isn't a place for personal inspiration experiments. Before Leonard could respond, Amira spoke up. Her voice was calm, but each word landed like a stone. Degrees won't help when a child is screaming in a supermarket and the mother collapses onto the floor. I've been there. I've cradled my brother through nights where he couldn't speak a single word, only cried until exhaustion. That's the kind of reality your reports never capture. Silence gripped the room. The faces, long accustomed to numbers and graphs, turned toward their screens, avoiding Amira's direct gaze. Leonard leaned back in his chair, arms folded, expression halfway between defiance and pride. The CFO tried to counter. We need trained experts. Personal anecdotes can't replace evidence-based practice. Amira turned to him, unwavering. I accept science. But tell me, has anyone in this room ever had to choose between working the night shift and taking their child to speech therapy? Has anyone ever endured the looks of disgust when their brother slammed his head against a wall in public? No? Then I bring what you lack. The truth. The room grew heavier. Leonard gave a weary but triumphant smile. He placed his hands on the table, his tone firm. This is exactly why she's here. This foundation doesn't need another PhD on a shelf. It needs a voice from those who live this reality every day. And if you refuse to listen, all your perfect metrics are no better than shredded paper. A tense pause followed. No one wanted to admit it, yet no one could deny it. A reluctant, collective silence settled over the room, not acceptance, but recognition. Amira didn't smile in victory. She stayed seated, hands clasped in her lap, her eyes distant. When the meeting ended, Leonard walked beside her and spoke quietly. You just did something I never dared to do, face them. With the truth. Amira replied softly, not looking up. I wasn't trying to win. I want families like mine to have a seat at the table. Leonard said nothing. But inside, something rang like a bell. This isn't just about Jonas and me anymore. This is the beginning of a revolution. In the following weeks, it wasn't just the foundation's board that began to shift. Leonard's apartment in Berlin started to change too. Once, it had the suffocating air of a miniature office, therapy schedules plastered across the walls, conference calls ringing nonstop, and a small child curled up in a corner of darkness, crying endlessly. Though challenges remained, the space had begun to hold fleeting moments of rare peace. Jonas started sleeping longer stretches. Not every night, but enough that Leonard no longer found himself cradling his son at 3 a.m. with trembling arms. One evening, as Leonard laid out dinner, apfelmus and a few slices of rye bread, he handed Jonas the small fork without much hope. But the boy took it, tapped the plate, and slowly lifted a spoonful of applesauce to his mouth. No screaming. No throwing. Just a simple movement. Leonard sat frozen, the glass of water trembling in his hand. He whispered, barely audible, Mein Gott, my son. And when Jonas leaned his head against his shoulder voluntarily, not resisting contact but seeking it, Leonard felt a weight fall from his chest. The change was quiet. No cameras recorded it, just a small gesture. But to Leonard, it was irrefutable proof that he had not failed. He knew precisely who had planted the seeds for these moments. Amira. Not because she was directly present with Jonas, but because she had changed him. She had taught him to listen to silence, accept irregular rhythms, and be patient instead of trying to control. Leonard began lowering his voice when he spoke, waiting instead of urging, and believing in small victories rather than chasing perfect solutions. One weekend morning, sunlight filtering through the curtains, Leonard was pouring coffee when he heard a faint sound behind him. He turned and nearly dropped the cup. Jonas was standing in the living room, eyes wide, mouth slowly moving. Then came a sound, faint, but unmistakable. Hello. One word. Brief. But to Leonard, it was the most beautiful sound he had heard since his wife was alive. The coffee almost slipped from his hand. He dropped to his knees, eyes brimming. Jonas, say it again, please. But Jonas didn't repeat it. He only smiled dreamily and stepped forward, holding out a crayon, drawing to his father. 3 figures holding hands, a tall man, a small boy, and a woman with curly hair tied back in a scarf. Leonard took the drawing with trembling fingers, vision blurred. He didn't need Jonas to say another word. His son had seen, remembered, and accepted Amira as part of his small, stormy world. That night, Leonard sat beside Jonas's bed for a long time, listening to his son's steady breathing. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was chasing ghosts. He was present. Not perfect, but enough. And deep in his heart, he knew, thanks to a street-side waitress with patient eyes, he and his son had found a way out of the maze of despair. Autumn blanketed the suburban roads of Germany in golden hues. Leonard, once used to sleek conference rooms in Berlin, now sat in a small hall in Leipzig, creaky plastic chairs, flickering fluorescent lights casting a cold glow on a stained ceiling. There were no media, no cameras, just a few dozen parents, some teachers, and children nestled quietly in their parents' arms. Amira stood at the front. No waitress uniform, no formal blazer. Just a simple sweater, her familiar red bandana, and a precise and gentle voice. She spoke of Musa, her younger brother, the nights he screamed until he couldn't breathe, the mornings at school filled with judgmental stares, and the one time he burst out laughing at a Wolof tune their father used to sing. Leonard listened in silence, not interrupting, carefully jotting down every story shared by parents in the room. A mother sobbed as she recounted being thrown out of a supermarket because her child had knocked over a display. An elderly teacher, voice trembling, admitted, "I have 28 students, but only 2 hands. I can't help them all." A grandmother, hands shaking, said she had to choose between buying her heart medication or paying for her grandchild's speech therapy. Leonard wrote it all down, every word. But this time, they weren't just cold notes. For the first time, he wasn't seated as the man who rescued with money, but as someone simply there to listen. Beside him, Amira not only took notes, she stepped down, sat beside those in tears, held them when words failed. After Leipzig came Dresden, then Nuremberg, places that had never appeared on the donation maps of big corporations. They rented church halls, borrowed old classrooms, and sometimes just sat in circles in small community rooms. Everywhere they went, there were forgotten stories. Everywhere they went, silent tears fell onto sleeves. One evening in Stuttgart, after a sharing session had ended, Leonard and Amira walked together down a quiet street. Yellow lights reflected off the damp pavement. Leonard spoke softly, voice almost confessional. "All my life, I've been building companies, controlling markets, commanding numbers. But sitting in those small rooms, I realize I don't know anything at all." Amira stopped, turned her head toward him. "And yet, you still show up. People think you have everything. But really, you're learning all over again." Leonard gave a faint laugh, but his gaze was softer. "Not just learning. I think I'm growing up all over again." They paused by a bridge, autumn wind gently brushing past. A long silence. Then Amira said quietly, her voice low but clear, "You're doing well, Leonard. You don't have to try so hard with me. I already see it." Those words made Leonard stop in his tracks. He turned to look at her, realizing that his shoulders had relaxed somewhere along the way. In that moment, amid the empty street and the slow-flowing river, 2 worlds, a tech billionaire and a restaurant waitress, stood side by side, with no more class divide, just 2 people with their wounds, finding resonance in the most unexpected place. They said nothing more. Both returned to the hotel in silence, but inside Leonard, a quiet thought echoed. Maybe this is the real beginning. After long journeys, returning to Berlin, Leonard was no longer the man he used to be. He still sat in the corporation's top-floor office, signed contracts, and met with brilliant minds. But at night, he knew the most critical moment of his life wasn't in numbers. It was in the small apartment where Jonas and Amira were present. One morning, dim sunlight filtered through the curtains. Leonard was making coffee when he heard a faint sound behind him. He turned, his heart skipping a beat. Jonas stood in the living room with messy hair and wide eyes. His lips trembled, and then a weak but clear sound came out. "Hello." The coffee mug nearly slipped from Leonard's hands. He froze, then dropped to his knees in front of his son, his voice choked. "Jonas. Say it again. Bitte. Einmal mehr." "Jonas. Please say it again. Just once more." Jonas didn't repeat it, but he smiled, eyes briefly lighting up, then walked over and handed his father a crayon drawing. Leonard took it, his hands trembling. On the rough paper were 3 simple figures: a tall man, a small boy, and a woman with curly hair tied under a scarf. All 3 are holding hands. Leonard froze, tears welling up. He looked over at Amira standing silently at the doorway, having just arrived that morning. Her eyes were wide, sparkling. Jonas moved closer, resting his head on her shoulder. Amira hesitated slightly, then wrapped her arms around the boy, gently stroking his hair. "Das ist das erste Wort?" she asked softly, trembling. "Is that the first word?" Leonard nodded, tears running down his face. "Yeah. Erstes Wort. Hello." "Yes, first word, hello." There was no applause, no cameras, no press lenses. Just three people in a morning-lit room, breaths intertwined, tears and smiles mixing. It was more meaningful for Leonard than the day his company went public. For Amira, it was proof that patience and trust had not been in vain. Jonas closed his eyes, still leaning against Amira. Leonard looked at the drawing again. The boy hadn't only seen his father, but also seen himself. He had seen Amira too, and placed her in the center of his small, stormy world. At that moment, Leonard knew this was no longer a job opportunity or a foundation revolution. This was a family. It was not perfect in the conventional sense, but it was enough to make him feel he was no longer fighting the world alone. He folded the paper, pressed it to his chest, and whispered his voice like a vow. Wir sind zusammen, immer. We are together. Always. 2 weeks after the Hallow moment, Amira took a few days off to visit her mother and younger brother Musa in the outskirts of Berlin. Leonard's apartment suddenly felt empty again. Jonas still ate and slept, but inside Leonard was an indescribable void. He realized that every morning no longer had the gentle knock on the door, but had Amira's quiet singing while preparing Apfelmus for Jonas. On the third night, Leonard sat alone in his home office. The laptop screen glared with the council report, but the paper before him only had 4 words written repeatedly. Ich vermisse sie. I miss her, not just because of work, not just because Jonas was calmer when Amira was around, but because Leonard himself had become a different man when she was in the house. On Wednesday morning, the apartment door swung open. Amira returned, carrying a small paper bag. Jonas rushed to hug her, not saying a word, just clinging tightly as if afraid she might disappear. Leonard stood frozen at the door, heart tightening. Amira placed the bag on the table. I brought you this. Leonard opened it. Inside was a child's sock with a Spider-Man print. Little Musa had worn it for the first time without crying. Leonard smiled, eyes slightly wet. That's a big win. Amira crossed her arms, looked directly at him. You're not okay, are you? Leonard froze. For years, he had hidden exhaustion behind a cold iron mask of a CEO. But this time, he didn't have the strength to pretend. He stepped forward, voice choking. I've spent my whole life building, controlling. I thought the world wouldn't swallow me if I were strong enough, smart enough. But I can't control Jonas. I can't control the grief of losing my wife. And I can't control the fear that you won't be here someday. Amira was silent for a few seconds. Then she stepped forward, pulling a folded paper from her coat pocket. She unfolded it and handed it to Leonard. It was a crayon drawing 3 figures holding hands, the boy, the tall man, and the woman with curly hair tied under a scarf. Amira's voice was low but firm. Jonas drew this yesterday. No one prompted him. He drew it himself. He sees you. He sees himself. And he sees me. Jonas has decided. I'm not going anywhere. Leonard looked at the drawing, tears welling, this time without restraint. He broke down not with despair but with release. All the cold armor, the years of holding in, shattered. He brought his hands to his face, shoulders trembling. Amira stepped forward and placed her warm hand on his chest, right where his heart was pounding. You don't have to do this alone anymore. You have us. No kiss, no vow, just 3 people in a small room, breathing together. Leonard no longer needed to chase the past. He needed to uphold an untouchable image. He only needed to be present. A father, imperfect but loving. A man who could lean on someone else. A human being was enough for Jonas to feel safe. That night, Leonard sat by the bed, listening to Jonas sleep peacefully, still holding the drawing of the 3 of them. He smiled in the dark and whispered, Wir sind zusammen. Immer. We are together, always. The story didn't end with applause or flashing media lights. It ended with a simple choice. A spoonful of apple puree, a hand reaching out, a person daring to look into another's pain and say, I'm here. And sometimes that's enough to change a life.